This is Keep Up. I'm your host, Cynthia Dill. It's Friday, June 5th, 2026. I'm in my Cape Elizabeth studio, TGIF. This is a podcast about why 17% of Americans trust government. It's the lowest level of trust, really, since the beginning of time, I think. And one reason why Americans' trust of government is so low is because of the deep state, the unelected overregulation by bureaucrats. And this podcast is a story about the deep state here in Maine, the deep state at the Maine Human Rights Commission that is all trans all the time. And the story begins in, where it always begins, right? Um, in the beginning. And I think people who have followed this podcast know that I'm involved in a case against the Maine Department of Corrections on behalf of female inmates who are forced to be housed with violent male predators because of Maine's gender identity laws that were massively overhauled in 2019. And 2019 is when the Human Rights Commission presented its annual bill to kind of make, housekeeping um, measures to clean up the Human Rights Act. Has one bill to kind of address maybe there's been decisions at the Supreme Court that have to be incorporated into the law, or just there's one bill that the agency presents, and it's not supposed to hide major policy changes. Okay, it's not supposed to be a place where you can advance a political agenda without public comment or opportunity for hearing, but that's unfortunately what's happened. And in this case, in 2019, the I mean, it's just like what I predicted. And the reason why I know this story is because I did a freedom of access request in connection with my case against the prison, requesting all of the public documents related to the adoption of gender identity into the Human Rights Act as a separate protected status in 2019, and specifically communication between the Human Rights Commission and various advocacy groups. And sure enough, it wasn't the Human Rights Commission or the Human Rights Commission staff even who suggested the definition of gender identity that made its way into our Human Rights Act that now serves as the basis for all of the chaos in society that been a blurring of lines between the legal rights of women to have, safe and private spaces and our own athletic teams. And the reason why is because in 2019, the gender identity definition was expanded to include this sort of really woke definition. The gender identity is defined to mean your deep set feelings about gender regardless of your sex assigned at birth, which is just a mumbo jumbo way of saying that your own self-declared uh, sex. They eliminated the biological difference between male and female and sort of set up our laws to be that anytime any man can say that he identifies as a woman and have access to private spaces. So I'm really interested in that. I did a freedom of access request. I got a reply finally after there was a paywall put up initially saying this was going to take so much time and it was going to cost $2,000. Well, it was about 170 pages, and sure enough, the story is just like we suspected. The executive director of Equality Maine, who also happens to be the majority leader of the Democratic Party, initiates communication with the Council for the Human Rights Commission, who has a trans daughter and is suddenly everything trans, and proposes to meet with, advocates in the LGBTQ plus coalition to suggest some changes to the law. And the suggested changes are, in fact, drafted and submitted by Mary Bonato at Glad Law, who is a rock star in Maine politics because she won the Supreme Court case that, made same-sex marriage protected under the Constitution, which I fully support. But the point is that the counsel for the Humane Human Rights Commission and the executive director met with a group that included the Democratic Party representatives, right? Lawyers for the Democratic Party, lobbyists for Democrat, you know, causes from um, Bernstein Shore. Kate Knox is the lawyer for the Democratic Party, the ACLU, the Maine Women's Lobby, and Equality Maine. And they meet with Mary Bonato in a conference room, and they come up with a strategy to get gender identity into this bill, and they orchestrate, basically choreograph the public hearing. And the communications between the lawyer for the Maine Human Rights Commission and all these advocates in the Democratic Party started in late December of 2018, went into 2019. The back and forth between the groups before they came up with the definition that made its way into the proposed law took just a couple of weeks. The bill is published in May of 2019. There's a public hearing in 2019. And in June of 2019, it's the law. Gender identity is a newly defined protected status under the Maine Human Rights Act that enables any man at any time to identify as a woman or identify as a gender something. It's very vague, but have legal access without question to female spaces, female athletic teams, female jails. Okay, in my case, that is a horror story. Shelters, lesbian groups. I mean, you name it. There's no place now where men can't demand access and get it based on the gender identity law. So, I think what's disappointing to me is that the public, and the reason this goes to the lack of trust in government, it really, Barbara Hirsch is the attorney for the Maine Human Rights Commission. Okay. She apparently didn't present any, like other side of the story to the commissioners. We have this activist Human Rights Commission executive director and lawyer who are giving bad, false advice to the Maine Human Rights Commission and otherwise just testifying on behalf of the commission with apparently no public vote, no even comment by the actual Human Rights Commission. So I don't see where Barbara Hirsch and the executive director get the authority to appear at a hearing, for instance, in just this year around the sports issue. Okay, so that the activists changed the law in 2019, which enables students. Thereafter, Barbara Hirsch issued, memorandums that contain bad legal advice, like incorrect partisan legal advice. And so all the rules are changed, which, has led us to where we are now, which is boys identifying as girls suddenly in maybe junior or senior year when they won a state championship and getting the state championship, taking that place, taking that accolade, taking that honor, that opportunity for a scholarship away from girls. Okay, that's discrimination. The girls do not have a single sex sport. They do not have an equal opportunity to sports. And so there were bills to, undo that injustice because nobody knew in 2019 when the definition of gender identity was changed, it would have this impact because we never were informed. We never had an opportunity for a hearing. The people who we pay to, elevate these issues and present them to the public for a fair hearing did not do their job. They were partisans. They show up and they testify, I believe, falsely. The the commission counselor and the executive director went to Augusta, gave testimony to the Judiciary Committee, and they said, opposed to all the so-called transgender sports bills. This is in May of 2025, LDs 233-868, 1002, 1134, blah, 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 blah. These are the bills protecting, requiring public schools to use the name and gender on a child's birth certificate. The most important one was prohibiting transgender women, i.e., boys and men from playing sports on the team aligning with their gender identity. So that's like a bad way of saying the proposed bill would have mandated athletics to be separated on the basis of sex, which is something that we did for a really, really long time. In fact, we did it up until 2019. Um, and it was only after 2019 that we started to have these issues um, because suddenly we have this gender identity law that gives so-called trans kids this right to self-declare that they are a trans kid and can play on the athletic team that matches their so-called gender identity. And it caused utter confusion. And more importantly, it caused safety concerns for girls. Girls were being hurt physically, denied the opportunity for fair sport, and embarrassed, shamed, intimidated, assaulted in bathrooms and locker rooms that they're forced to share with boys who, let's face it, they're boys. They still have the anatomy of boys. They still have the chromosomes of boys. They still have, in almost all instances in Maine at that age, the testosterone of boys going through puberty. I mean, it's so unfair. And so for the Human Rights Commission counsel who has a trans daughter who she talks about, she's on record saying that like one of her number one goals is to advocate for transgender rights. That's like her personal goal. And here she is as the lawyer, and that she's making it the goal of our state. And the executive director is trans. So we've got these two unelected bureaucrats speaking for the Maine Human Rights Commission, saying that these bills trying to protect girls' sports are, I mean, this is the most blatant, like, hyperbole, the testimony that they gave. If this was about if these bills are not about sports or safety, these bills are about fear and about who is allowed in women's locker rooms. And they say that, um, you know, the fear is that men who must be masquerading as women in order to harm cisgender women in restrooms. That's what they say these bills are about. Well, guess what? Even if they are about that, that's a real concern. You know what? Like that is a concern. And and it's not just by cisgender women, which is like a term I reject. I do not consent to being called a cisgender woman. That's misgendering me. I object. But nonetheless, the Human Rights Commission executive director, the lawyer, unelected bureaucrats taking these strong stands against girls. Not a single person has been advocating for the rights of girls since day one. In 2019, when the Maine Human Rights Commission agreed to meet with the Democratic Party and the lobbyists from Equality Maine and the ACLU and the Maine Women's Lobby, nobody was there speaking up for girls. Nobody raised their hand and said, if we're going to tinker with protections on the basis of sex, that might be, a harm to girls' rights. Nobody. And now that people are speaking up for girls, we're being accused of being hateful and transphobic. These people just failed doing their job, failed doing their job. Their job is not to appear before the Judiciary Committee without any public notice, without the Human Rights Commission. Okay, we have commissioners who are appointed, supposed to be 3 of one party and 2 of the other. And the commissioners themselves should make decisions about whether or not the Human Rights Commission is going to be opposed to bills that protect women and girls. The decisions should not be made by trans activists, and that's who we have running the Human Rights Commission. I mean, it's really indisputable. You get these freedom of access request responses, and it's there before your eyes. They are all trans all the time. Now they're suing school districts. And so here's the thing, stay tuned. Because just like GLAD Law wrote the law in Maine, GLAD Law being an out-of-state so-called nonprofit corporation that raises over $10 million and pays its high-paid lobbyists in excess of $225,000 a year. They don't disclose who their donors are. So it's essentially a dark money organization. I'm sorry, there's no way to whitewash that. They do not disclose their donors, and they make their agenda all about trans. So, in my view, it's reasonable to infer that the money that they get has with it, it's earmarked for trans rights. And just like the Human Rights Commission gets grants specifically to, learn about, i.e., advocate for trans rights. So, these organizations get this money. They're fighting these fights on behalf of these special interest groups behind closed doors. No, there was no public hearing ever on the impact of gender identity on the rights of women and girls. And that should be like number 1 for the next governor. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent. Okay, this issue, there needs to be a public discussion about this issue because this was passed really under behind the scenes. It was the law that dramatically changed the landscape for women and girls, depriving us of our safety, privacy, dignity, and civil rights, protections under the Constitution. This state-imposed gender ideology was brewed up in a conference room that included the Democratic Party, left-wing special interest groups, and, a couple of unelected bureaucrats from the Maine Human Rights Commission. And not once has the public been given a fair analysis of the law and of the facts. There's references to so-called marginalized groups without any data whatsoever. This is just the agenda of the Democratic Party that the Human Rights Commission is pushing through. And so now they have, not only is it the lawyers at the Human Rights Commission, it's the lawyers who are advising school districts about, what they can and can't do because of gender identity laws. They're all partisan hacks as well, just feeding into this agenda, so that they can get hired by the Democrats and the Democratic-led organizations. I mean, the state really has become quite partisan in the culture wars. And one way we could avoid every issue from being a strictly blue or red issue is to have commissions like the Human Rights Commission that's made up of bipartisan members debate issues while having been given correct information. I mean, the human rights commissioners were denied good legal advice from their own counsel. Okay? She's saying that the law court decision mandates that every kid has to have, a gender identity, like it have privileges and benefits match their gender identity. That's like the opposite of what the law court said in 2014. Okay, the law court said in 2014 in the case that the Human Rights Commission lawyer refers to, and I believe misrepresents the holding of, the law court case involving Nicole Maines, who was a transgender girl with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, a well-documented, well-accepted diagnosis of gender dysphoria, who sought out an accommodation, a public accommodation, and an analysis was done whether or not the school allowing this child to use the girls' bathroom was a reasonable accommodation. The law court found that it was and mandated that the school provide Nicole Maines use of the girls' bathroom. Okay, that was the holding in that case. The law court said in that case, okay, given that analysis of an accommodation for a child with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, the law court said, we do not suggest that any person could demand access to any school facility or program based solely on a self-declaration of gender identity or confusion without the plans developed in cooperation with the school and the accepted and respected diagnoses that are present in this case. So what the Human Rights Commission Council suggested to the Judiciary Committee in that bill that was written by special interest groups was that, oh, this is just a clarification. We're adding, the definition of gender identity because we had to clear things up, just avoid confusion. No, that was a major overhaul of the law. That was doing exactly what the law court said we shouldn't do. So for the lawyer to say that that they were moving in a direction that was consistent with the law court is not true. And it's not fair that the human rights commissioners were led to believe that this is sort of a non-controversial issue. There's no public discussion of it. The law is passed within a month, and now we're stuck with it. And so Now the Human Rights Commission is suing school districts because school districts have like had the courage to say, you know what, we are going to protect girls and we're going to reject the advice of the partisan lawyers who our partisan school boards have hired, and we're going to reject the gender ideology and we're going to separate athletics on the basis of biological sex because it's very easy to do and it's very fair because every child has a sex. There are two sexes. Every child has to provide a birth certificate upon registration at school. On the birth certificate is their sex. Sports can be separated on the basis of sex simultaneously while allowing the complete and free expression of anyone's gender identity. So boys who identify as girls can identify as girls and play on the boys' team. It's simple. But because those school boards took those reasonable measures using the democratic process and local control, the Human Rights Commission, okay, on the advice of its lawyer and its executive director, two trans activists, unelected bureaucrats with a, stated personal interest in advancing transgender rights, apparently over the rights of girls. Okay, it's pretty obvious. There's no way you can really come to any other conclusion. Um, they filed this lawsuit. So I did a freedom of access request because I want to see the communication between this GLAD law, uh, like lobbying organization that has the dark money behind it, that like it's testified at the state house, I think, like over 130 times in the last 5 years. That I want to see who wrote the lawsuit. I just suspect, I could be wrong. Okay, I just suspect that, like the gender identity law that was spoon fed to the Human Rights Commission by the lobbyists, by GLAD Law, okay, the actual language of the law, and not aired, like, never presented to perhaps like the Republican Party or like the groups that would might have an opposing view, never opened up for discussion, just passed through, written by the special interests. Well, let's just see if the lawsuit that sues our school districts is also written by special interests because, you know, um, that's why people don't trust government. I mean, I the Maine Human Rights Commission never had a public discussion about its decision to file lawsuits. They went into executive session. I'm sorry, that's not good enough. So we don't know what the lawyer told the commission. Fair enough. I don't need to know what advice was given. But I think the public does have a right to know on what basis the commission decided to use its limited resources to sue public school districts. And if, in fact, a special interest group wrote the lawsuit, then we need to clean up the Human Rights Commission and bring it back to its mission of actually protecting the civil rights of like marginalized groups. Okay, a majority of the claims that the Human Rights Commission process are claims by women, real women who have been discriminated against on the basis of sex. And now we have a Human Rights Commission being advised by a lawyer and an executive director who do not recognize the biological reality of sex. It's just mind-boggling. But you can't blame the commissioners. I mean, they're volunteers, I think. They probably believe that the lawyer is giving them the truth, and unfortunately, they're not getting the truth. And it's frustrating, but we'll get to the bottom of it. So stay tuned. The Human Rights Commission said it might take 3 weeks to get me the response to my freedom of access request about the communications between GLAD Law and the Human Rights Commission regarding this lawsuit, because I do want to see who wrote it. It just strikes me as uh, unlikely that the lawyer for the Maine Human Rights Commission wrote the complaint. I could be wrong though, but I'll let you know as soon as I know. And until next time, this is Cynthia Dill signing off. Take care.